Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. Today on the show, we're going to talk about the origins of everything that makes food possible. We're going to be speaking with David Haskell in his brand new book, How Flowers Made Our World. This is incredible. David is a writer and biologist, acclaimed for his lyrical explorations of the living world. His most recent book, How Flowers Made Our World, explores the creative powers of flowering plants. Science writer Elizabeth Colbert described the book as mind blowing, and I have to say that I agree. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into this, David. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Cassandra. So great to be with you. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. So I guess so much to say. I mean, so many great things to say about the book. One of the themes that really came across to me was this distinction between revolution versus evolution. I think a lot of people perhaps disregard the flowers that surround us in our world. And you did just such an incredible job of teasing out all of the ways they influence our lives. So maybe we could start there. Like, what do you mean when you talk about the story of nature's revolution or
Ye-
revolutionary?
Yeah, but for biologists, the word revolution is not often used, right? Because
Mhm.
life has been innovating, doing all kinds of cool things for about 4 billion years. So let's not over uh, exaggerate the number of revolutions that have happened. But there have been a few, like the oxygen revolution, when the first microbes are putting oxygen into the atmosphere. Nothing was ever again the same on planet Earth after that. When complex animals started moving around and swimming, that was another revolution. And then when flowering plants evolved, that was another one, but it's lesser known even within biology. Maybe because flowers uh, were latecomers in the story of life's evolution, right? They've only been around for a little more than 100 million years. Yeah, that's a long time, but it's not 3 billion years or half a billion years the way that some other evolutionary stories go back. And the other thing about flowers is particularly in Western culture right now, we tend to dismiss them as merely ornamental.
Mhm.
They're pretty, but they're not particularly powerful. And some of that I think is gendered, right? So we often associate, at least this is not true in all cultures, and it certainly wasn't true even in Western culture for all times, but flowers with femininity. And in our current sort of patriarchy, we regard femininity as also ornamental, but not in charge and not powerful. And of course, flowers are bisexual biologically, and so the whole gender situation gets complicated. And our narrow boxes don't represent the biological diversity, the reality of actually what's happening with flowers. But yes, flowers, when they appeared on planet Earth, they opened opportunities for other species. Right? There would be no bees, there would be no butterflies. Most birds would be very different. Mammals, even human beings, probably wouldn't have evolved without flowering plants. They also changed the climate, right? Without flowering plants, you have no rainforests, you have no prairies, or mangroves, or seagrass beds. And so that they're major players in big scale things that transcend just the productivity of an individual flowering plant or even the flowering plant community into changing how the world is. So that's why I think they deserve the word revolutionary. And it's not just me. I mean, botanists call the time when they evolved the Cretaceous terrestrial revolution. Too modest, though, right? Because their revolutionary effects extended far beyond the Cretaceous. And it wasn't just the land that they changed, they also changed the oceans, weirdly. Uh,
Yeah, and you give so many great examples of how these kind of revolutionary creatures have also co-evolved with other creatures. I mean, almost as like truly ecosystem engineers, and
yeah.
how closely that's tied also to our own development as creatures, to human development. Um, I often tell my students in class, when in the future, if people are still on this earth, they're going to look back at us and call us, the people of the corn, the people of the corn period. But really, After reading your chapter on grasses, I'm like, I think it's more accurate to say we are the grass apes, as you just maybe you could tell us a bit about because that ties in so well with food. Like, why will we be known as the grass apes and how does this differentiate from our, other non-human primates that live in tropical forests?
Yeah, absolutely. If we were named for our main food, we would be Homo poaceae, right? Poaceae for the family of grasses, the Poaceae. And so, yes, I call ourselves grass apes, which, most people don't even think of grass as flowering plants because we keep them mowed and we just think of grass as just what we walk on when we're, walking around on the golf course or something. Well, no, grass is relatively recent evolutionary innovators, certainly um, main agents of deforestation for the last 10, 15 million years. Grasses have built these amazing ecosystems, extraordinarily diverse and important group of flowering plants. And one of the side effects of the evolution of grasses was the evolution of humans. Think about, let's start at the present day and work backwards. So today, roughly 60% of all the food calories that we humans eat come from just three species of grasses: maize, rice, and wheat. Then a whole lot of the rest of the calories come from other grasses: millet, barley, sugarcane, the pasture grasses that a lot of our livestock eat. Get converted into animal flesh, but it's essentially just grass. Prophet in the biblical account, the prophet Isaiah says, "All flesh is grass," and and there were all sorts of theological points that presumably he was trying to make. But what I take away is an ecological lesson: is like, oh yeah, and for humans at least, most of what we eat is indeed grass. So we are extraordinarily dependent as a species on the productivity of grasses and actually a rather small subset of all of the grasses in the world, which is, of course, is worrying because when you have an undiversified portfolio, then you're vulnerable to the changes. Wheat
Yeah.
rust, some evolution of rust in wheat could really devastate Homo sapiens for a while, or Homo poaceae, as I think we should now be. So in the present moment, we are dependent on grasses, but that dependence actually goes back long before the agricultural revolution, because of course our ancestors were living mostly in tropical forests. And what did they do? They came down out of the trees. This took a few million years, and I'm simplifying, but they came out of the trees into the savannas and grasslands. So without savannas and grasslands, again, humans wouldn't have evolved to become bipedal. We'd still be up in the trees eating fruits and nuts and little insects. Maybe that would have been a better outcome, but that's not how it worked out, right? We came bipedal. We went out to the savannas, and this story, of course, is taking place mostly in Africa, and from one species to another. And there was a great branching out of different experiments of how to build a little grassland primate. Australopithecus and various species of Homo erectus, and habilis, all the others. Eventually, we wind up with Homo sapiens eating either grasses or sedges directly. And we know that because of the signature, the isotopic signature in the teeth of fossils, or eating animals like wildebeest-like animals that we eating the grasses. So our evolution as clever little bipedal primates was catalyzed by grasses. And then before that, flowering plants, not grasses, but flowering plants played an important role, essential role in the evolution of primates. So primates as a group of mammals are about 60 million years old, more or less, and primates eat fruits, which of course only flowering plants produce fruits, and also the insects that are particularly abundant and particularly abundant in forests formed by flowering plants, which are mostly tropical forests. So at every stage of the way, when dependent on the flowers, we're a floral species, and lately we are a grassland species. So let's give the grasses some respect.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, what I love What I love so much about the way you set up, I mean, some of these topics are somewhat complicated, thinking about C3 and C4 and different pathways of energy storage and acquisition in plants. And what I loved is how you set up the differences between grasses and other beautiful flowering plants like orchids, and how grasses really invest a lot of energy into their
Mhm.
progeny. And orchids, their seeds are not quite the same. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for picking out that particular contrast because I think those are two ends of the spectrum in terms of uh, uh, parental investment. And I think just to put this in context, one of the great innovations of flowering plants was not just the petals and the aromas and working with the bees and all of that, which maybe we'll get to, and most people are familiar with that story. But flowering plants also reinvented motherhood for plants. So flowering plants, in all of them, enclose their seed inside some kind of fruit. And the technical term for flowering plants is angiosperm. Angion means a vessel that encloses the seeds. So technically, flowering plants are defined by the protective and nutritive enclosure that they produce, which is an act of motherly care for the little seeds within. Now, that care takes many different shapes and forms. Some of them we benefit from, right? When we eat a cherry, we're enjoying fruit that was intended originally for birds, but we wiggled our way into that relationship to help ourselves, and the cherry trees for the moment are benefiting from it as well. But orchids are like the extreme kind of neglectful parents, if you like. They produce what are called dust seeds. Basically, it's a tiny little embryo with a case with no food in it that just blows away in the wind. And when that little orchid germinates, it's going to be dependent on fungi to feed it. So it's very weird, very specialized form of mutual dependence with fungi. So the fungi are actually doing the mothering rather than the plant. So kind of unusual. Grasses are like the other end of the spectrum in that the mother plant is really loading up those seeds with lots of good food. And that's why we eat them, right? So the corn, nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody eats orchids because there are ice creams and other things made out of the roots of orchids, but orchid
Salad. Yeah.
seeds,
Uh-huh.
as far as I know, nobody is eating orchid seeds because you'd be very hungry. Um, Whereas, of course, wheat and rice and so forth are extremely nutritious. So what the mother plant is doing is first wrapping that grass seed in all kinds of layer of wrapping that is dry and husk-like, what we call the chaff, a very dismissive term for really beautiful structures. If you look at grass seed under the microscope or even just closely in your hand, these layers that are designed to hook onto bird wings or onto animal fur or catch the wind, really beautiful diversity of the fruity forms and the other papery surfaces that the mother plant gives to the little seed. But then inside the seed, big packet called endosperm, which is the food for the developing embryo. If you sprout wheat seeds on your windowsill, just get some wheat from the Whole Foods market or wherever you get the unprocessed wheat from, put it on some damp cotton paper towel on your windowsill in the kitchen. And within a few days, those little wheat seedlings have shot up to several inches tall, incredibly fast. I mean, it really is actually shocking to see how quickly they blast into the world. I mean, literally like a rocket taking off. And they're not doing that because it's through photosynthesis. They're drawing on that endosperm, which is carbohydrates, fats, lipids, and so on, that the mother has loaded into the seed to set them off with a little food hamper so that they can really sprint in the original when they first germinate. I should say though that endosperm in a way is kind of a horror movie because what endosperm is botanically is a doomed sibling. So when pollen lands on and this is true for all flowering plants, but let's just talk about grasses. When the grass pollen lands and germinates, there's not just one, but two little sperm nuclei that swim down this little pollen tube, and eventually one of them joins with the egg. Sperm meets egg, and you have an embryo. We're familiar with that story. That's how we came about, right? But then there's the other little sperm cell that meets with these sort of ladies in waiting cells that hang around with the egg. So there's a second fertilization that forms this sibling to the embryo. But all that sibling does is load up with food, and it's never going to do anything except die in the process of feeding its sibling, the embryo. So endosperm is like the doomed sibling that is sacrificed so that the embryo can actually grow. So it's kind of a little bit horrific if we think of it in human terms, but it's also a really beautiful way in terms of cell biology and the development of plants that the flowering plants have given their seeds a head start. Many of them, I mean, orchids are a little bit of an exception there, but many of them give them a head start. That then also, even though the plants didn't plan it this way, turns out they also feed much of the rest of the world. Like, so no, it's not just us. So many other animals depend on eating those seeds that are loaded with endosperm to fuel themselves. There would be no grassland birds. I mean, lots of other
Yeah.
creatures, lots of insects also feed on endosperm. And so, so motherhood in flowering plants is enormously important innovation, both for the flowering plants and for the rest of the ecology of the planet, humans included.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, and this is yes, what feeds us, and I love the imagery of like, here's your little picnic basket of food to go off into the world to get
Yep.
started. It's great. And the thing with fungi that and the orchid relationship is really striking to me because I've told you before some of the work I've done in the Balkans looking at terrestrial orchids, which are harvested for making different sweets like a salad.
Hmm.
But also orchids have this crazy, lubricant-like surfactant quality to some of their tubers as well, to some of the underground structures, and as I was reading your writing about how certain orchids invite in specific fungi and they kind of feast off of them and have this relationship. It got me thinking, could this surfactant like property be helpful in this process? Or are there also certain types of antifungals that they're producing to keep
Hmm.
sure certain fungi but attract others? I mean, there's incredible chemistry happening there. I don't know that we've really answered any of those questions yet, but maybe you can tell us a bit about that relationship because it's really unique.
Sure, it is. And to me, it's delicious because it subverts some of the simple allegories that we tell ourselves about flowering plants. So I think, most elementary school kids are familiar with the idea that there's a mutualism between the flower and the pollinating insects, and the little bees get their food, and the flower gets pollinated, and it's all just love and tenderness out there in the world. And that is, in fact, true. The flowers did remake the world through ramping up cooperation with other species, including fungi, but also pollinating insects. Orchids take it into some places where the reciprocity and the cooperation is not so clear. And in fact, sometimes it's just plain old parasitism, which as a writer, that's kind of interesting. You've got some tensions between the goodness and the exploitation happening. And in terms of evolution, it's an interesting evolutionary dynamic, let alone, what a writer might think about it. So yes, these orchids, first of all, dependent on fungi for germination and the early growth of their uh, of their embryos as it's first developing. Uh, I should say that lab studies and studies in the field give slightly different answers about how selective orchids are in terms of which fungi they'll unite with. Right. So in the lab, it seems like that, yeah, they'll join up with kind of not any fungus, but with a lot of different fungi, because these little orchids are looking to draw nutrition from the fungus into their body. And they do that actually by allowing the fungus to grow into the embryonic tissues and the growing tissues of the little baby orchid. And then the orchid and fungus forms this weird little set of little fingers with little balls on the end that the orchid then digests. It's a structure that's not known in any other family of plants, even though lots of plants, of course, share nutrients with fungi. Orchids have developed their own sort of microstructure of how to do that so that the orchid is literally eating the fungus up inside its body. And then later, of course, the orchid, if it's successful, develops into an adult orchid that continues that relationship with the fungus. And sometimes it really is truly mutualistic in that the orchid is photosynthesizing and sending some of that carbon down to the fungus, and the fungus is reciprocating with minerals in the similar way that many other fungi and plants do around the world in all sorts of ecosystems. In other cases, it looks like that orchid just continues to be kind of a bit of a, uh, I think of them as like lice or ticks, sucking on the fungus, taking but not really giving much back, at least in terms of the calculations that people have done so far. I should say, though, that in researching this, I was like you, that, this thing about fungi and orchids is a very generative place to put your imagination. Because I'm like, okay, what happens in a drought? Maybe those fungi are putting up with a certain amount of quote unquote parasitism so that they have a nice, safe place to ride out the drought inside that orchid tissue and then come back out when conditions get better or when a fire comes through or when the soil disturbs. So the costs and benefits for the fungi and the orchids really, in my mind, are not really fully explored and developed in terms of scientific study, because fungi are such sneaky little creatures to actually study. In terms of the chemistry, and you know this much better than I do, that because the relationship is so deep, like, and intimate at the cellular level, exactly which organism is producing these um, quote unquote, secondary metabolites, other chemicals, or is it formed because of the interaction between them? Often that is another thing that is not known, right? That we might, I think, would be a fruitful avenue for further for, for further study. So some of these orchids are indeed cooperative and lovely symbiotic fairy tales. But other ones tell stories that are a little bit more, with a little more deception. And that's a theme that, honestly, the original subtitle of this book included was How Flowers Made Our World, Revolutions of Cooperation, Beauty, and Illusion.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and, the orchids are kind of illusionists in that they're often pretending to be one thing and they are actually another. So when they're signaling pollinators, sometimes they're pretending they've got pollen, but they don't, or they're pretending to be a female insect, which they absolutely are not. And and with the fungi, you wonder, okay, why are these fungi putting up with the orchids sucking their juices out? Well, a lot of these fungi have got massive bodies. They're decaying huge. They're eating big logs out in the forest. And here you've got this one tiny little orchid embryo drawing some nutrients out of it. It's a pretty minimal cost. And so maybe like a grocery store that puts up with a certain amount of shoplifting, um, because otherwise, if everything in your grocery store is behind lock and key, and a grocery store worker has to unlock it for you, nobody's going to shop there, right?
Mhm.
So grocery stores have a certain amount of openness to them, and they tolerate a certain amount of shoplifting, although they don't encourage it because that's how you do business. And the same thing with the fungus, right? If the fungus just shut itself off from all interactions with plants because a few little orchids were parasitic, the fungus wouldn't be nearly as successful. So I think there's a little bit of that going on as well with these
Yeah.
orchids and their fungi.
Oh, I mean, it's fascinating. I love when I guess as I read your book too, one of the themes that really came across is this concept of the chemical language of nature and signaling. And I think you're writing about the rose really
Hmm.
explores this so well. This idea of, why does a rose smell the way it does? And why does like a
Yep.
corpse plant smell so awful?
Hmm.
And, our plants, they're just talking to one another, to other creatures all the time. And we're picking up on that language. I mean, What did you find to be the most fascinating in your research for the book around this kind of chemical language of plants?
Yeah. Well, the most delightful thing, of course, was actually having an excuse to go and smell all of these. And I talk a little bit about the roses in a minute. But sort of at an intellectual level, we so often think about plants as, even if we recognize that they're alive and they're active beings and so on, as being rather simple compared to, say, human language. And yet, if you look at the number of molecules that are bouncing around inside a plant cell and going from one plant cell to another within a plant, and then look at the number of those little molecules that are either going through the soil, root to root, or as aromatics going, volatile organic compounds going in the air from one plant to another, there are literally thousands and thousands of chemicals. I mean, far more than we have letters in our alphabet, and equivalent perhaps to the number of words that we have in our everyday language. Now, of course, I don't want to analogize too much here in that human language has its own form, its own grammar, has its own evolutionary history, and it's and marvelous in its own way. And plants are not little humans or humanoids, but there is a parallel in the degree of complexity of the information that is signaled from one organism to another, the degree of nuance that is possible when you've got, for example, in a rose, 400 different volatile organic molecules in what we call, quote unquote, the aroma of rose. There are 400 different components of that. And so now some of those, I should say, we have elaborated through selective breeding because we love them and we want to make perfumes out of them. And we're one of the animals that has worked with flowering plants to the, to the plant's benefit mostly, and also to our benefit. So we're one of the mediators of beauty out there in the world with flowering plants. Um, so complexity and nuance, and of course, ecological specificity as well. So, um, and again, most of this is actually unknown because people haven't asked, what does the aroma of every single one of the flowers in the world? I mean, there's 350,000 different species of flowering plants, and we have not decoded the aromatic language of each of their floral aromas. But it's clear that the aroma profiles are cued into local pollinator communities, and to the pollinators that are going to be the most efficient. In some cases, it's very specific. So a set of aroma molecules are speaking to one single species of wasp, for example, and calling that wasp in an orchid or to a fig plant, and getting very faithful and reliable and efficient pollination from that. In others, roses are probably one of those, although roses are mostly not growing in their native habitats anymore. Or magnolia trees. I mean, here, I'm in Atlanta now, and lots of southern magnolias that they're a little bit out of their range here, but there are a lot of different sort of pollinators, mostly beetles and things that come to magnolia blooms. They're not trying to attract just one single pollinator. So from the plant's perspective, they want to put out the aromatic profile that most meets their needs in terms of the efficiency of pollination. And then there's, been some back and forth evolution, at least in some flowering plants, to specialize on the aromas that are most efficient for attracting some insects. And there's one group of orchids in particular that work with perfumer bees. These are bees that they're not just attracted by the aroma. They actually go to the flower and gather the aroma. They scrape up the oily aroma substance and put it in special little pouches and hairs on their legs and bodies. And these are all male bees. And when the male bees are courting females, they waft their wings over these little collections of aroma to produce this presumably beguiling and attractive perfume that speak in an aromatic language to these female bees of their species and not of other closely related species. So the specificity then flows out into the animal world as well, at least in some cases.
That's incredible. I mean, Humans love to cover ourselves in special scents, and we each have our own scent built by our host system, but also our microbes.
Mhm.
It's incredible how it all pieces together with these complex narratives. Um, I want to turn a little bit to conservation, and I love how you have a lot of storytelling in the book that kind of positions us as readers in a place around a specific plant story or a native plant that's being restored. Although you had a great phrase for that. You said that it's not about restoration, but reviving
Mm.
wild plants. That really struck me. I like this idea of, of a revival and of bringing people into these ecosystems. I think a lot of our listeners are fascinated with food. I think many probably also listen to the show because they're interested in plants. We talk a lot about plants on the show. What can you share with us about just practical ways that you've experienced, or things that you would recommend for folks to get more involved with local ecosystems, to really learn more about how to look at that incredible magnolia flower, how to contribute to
Mhm.
restoration of different plants and where they live?
Yeah, well, I love the fact that the stories resonated for you because there's a writer that really is my approach here. I mean, I talk about things like aromas and genome evolution and so forth, but in a way that hopefully is accessible to you don't have to have a biology degree by any stretch here. And the way to do that is by telling stories of particular flowers and particular places. And it was amazingly delightful and sometimes also, I mean, heartbreaking to visit some of these places and see and understand how people are working with flowers. In terms of deepening our own connection, I think listening to one's own dispositions and being open to what really attracts you. So, for example, if you've all got the pre-existing love of perfume, maybe a little collection of perfumes from the store or duty free store, I would, and in fact, this is one thing that I do, is just research a little bit which plant is in that perfume and what is the story of that plant? Where is it? Where did it first evolve? What are the pollinators that, other than humans, that are involved with that plant? What are the cultural stories about how that aroma got wrapped into our own human signaling? Um, for me, gardening has always been very important, especially gardening for food. I love to eat, and you know this very well. I've had the honor of actually visiting your garden and tasting some of the delicious food and aromatic plants you grow there. So that sensory connection that is satisfying a need, a hunger, a love, whether it's for perfume or for food or for spices and so forth. And tracing back the story of those plants through time. So that's one thing, listening to where one's energy already is. At the end of the book, I have a whole series of suggested invitations and exercises that people can do. Making perfume in your kitchen is kind of fun. Just put some, uh, how to use roses or jasmine plants to make your own perfume. But the simplest of all, and in a way the most powerful, is to just find a flower somewhere, maybe in your garden or in a local park or natural area, and sit with the flower. And this is basically a form of meditation. And give your senses over and over again to that flower. What am I smelling? What is the shape of this flower? And your mind wanders off to your shopping list or your to-do list or emails. It's like just let that thought go and return again and again to the flower. And then if you and I think just being with the flower in with our senses open is one practice that is amazing and that really deepens our connection to the flower. But then open your curiosity and imagination. To whom is this flower speaking? Right? Why is the flower shaped this way? And what insect or bird or maybe the flower is in conversation with the wind, right? Trying to carry pollen away or to receive pollen. So think about the form and the color of the flower. You can also imagine the electrical field around the flower because it turns out that every flower has a negative electrical charge. And the shape of that electrical field is species specific. A tulip has a very different shape of electrical field than a little maple flower or a daffodil or a rose. And we can't see that as humans. We can't sense that. But bees and hoverflies have little electro sensor hairs on their bodies, and they can actually read the electrical field of the flower. And so you can sit and imagine this. And also, and this isn't a metaphor, imagine the electrical charge between the flower and the pollinator, the insect, because the insect, by flying around, has acquired a positive charge. So here you've got positively charged little bee and a negatively charged flower. What's going to happen? It's a love story made out of the rules of physics. So as the flower, as the pollinator approaches the flower, there's an electrical attraction. And in fact, in some species, the pollen grains leap from the flower onto the pollinator because of that charge difference. Now, I mean, to me, this is really exciting because it opens the imagination. It's exciting scientifically because most of these studies that have described this have only come out in the last few years. So there is, for all grad students, undergrads, other people who want to find some cool study to do with it, with, if you have an inclination towards physics and electrical charges and botany, this to me is like, whoa, this is the place to go because there is so much to be discovered here. So that was a little bit of a tangent from the main point, which is sit with the flower and open your imagination and ask questions about that flower's relationship to the world. And, if you're inclined to ask, well, what flower is this one related to? All the roses have a similar kind of structure to cherry tree flowers and so on. And that's because of their kinship. All orchids and tulips look similar to other orchids and tulips because of these deep bonds of kinship. So we can read that into flowers as
That's
well.
incredible. Yeah, what I love about this too is, you don't have to be an explorer heading off to the Amazon to, some exotic tropical location to enjoy flowers. You can do this in your neighborhood, or in a lawn, with grass flowers. Get that hand lens
Yep.
out, look closely. Or,
Hmm.
one thing I loved was your storytelling around revisiting a plant at different times, even within the cycle of the day. Like, what happens to a flower at night? Who
Hmm.
comes to visit and stay versus who's there during the day? I mean, it's the power of observation just reveals so much when you really, like you said, sit with the flower.
And the world explodes. I mean,
Yeah.
every flower is a soap opera, right? Right. So it's this young little bud and then opens and say for a magnolia flower, it's a female part of the flower that's expressed first. And then the flower fully opens and the male part of the flower is expressed and the aroma really ramps up there, which is kind of an interesting thing is that many flowers are most aromatic, most perfumed when they're shedding pollen, which is the exact opposite of how they're portrayed in our contemporary Western culture. Uh, but then the little insects that are coming to visit, and of course, they're all having their little shenanigans in there. Some of them are eating one another. Got a spider eating little beetles. And then quite quickly, the petals die away and the wonderful aromas turn into the aroma more of a compost heap. But the flower isn't dead. The flower is moving on to another stage, and that is the maturation of the little embryos and the fruit. And then over weeks and months, instead of just days, as the petals matured, that flower then matures into a fruit. And for the magnolia flower, then it releases red seeds that then attract woodpeckers. So now, when I was younger, I would walk past a magnolia tree. It's like, whatever, it's a nice glossy tree. So what? Now I'm thinking, oh my goodness, is that tree, if it's the fall, I'm looking for the woodpeckers. How many species of woodpecker on this tree? Because I know there are literally hundreds of little red uh, seed hanging by silvery threads from those magnolia fruits. In the early summer, I'm thinking I've got to stop the car and get out and put my nose inside those flowers because I need that hit of magnolia aroma, which is one of my favorite plant aromas. And so this is, in a way, it's an antidote to the algorithms, the electronic algorithms that are trying to control our attention and our lives and our pocketbooks and our politics. Is if we open our attention and imagination to everyday things like the other one I love are the violets that grow as quote unquote weeds in my so-called
Oh,
lawn.
yes. Mhm.
Amazing biology. I mean, some of them actually bury their flowers into the soil and never open. They're kind of hidden asexual flowers. And then there are others that are opening and have this aroma and attracting different insects. So just outside my, fairly ordinary and very uncared for lawn, there are all these amazing stories that are far more interesting than doom scrolling. Not that we shouldn't pay attention and be active in the political world, but we need a way of restoring our relationship with the living earth, because otherwise, how we can be good neighbors and kin and stewards of this world if we're not actually in friendship relationships and sensory embodied relationships with other beings. And that sounds all very ponderous and moralistic, but really for me, it's about delight. It's beautiful. It's
It's
delightful.
it's joyful. Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation I had on the show with Doug Tallamy, who's an
Mhm.
entomologist and looks at the incredible diversity of insects,
Yeah.
around even a single species like a single oak tree and just the incredible just by carefully observing, and like you said, like, there's a whole soap opera of antics happening between the plant and the insects and mammals and birds and amphibians and, microbes that are all working together, and, I so agree with you when it comes to just the need to really build more human connections with nature, and, there was one other portion of the book I really quite enjoyed. I think you were with your sister, if I recall
Mhm.
correctly, looking at seagrasses and kind of tromping through
Yeah.
this muck and you know working toward restoration of also like aquatic plants. I think a lot of people don't think of perhaps plants growing in our oceans or the importance of those plants growing in our oceans, but they are so important. Um, and until you have gotten your hands in the muck, it's hard to really maybe appreciate that. I mean, would you
Yeah.
agree? And as you know, I'm a big tree hugger. I love to get up close and personal with plants whenever I
Yeah.
can because it's just my way of really having that connection. Yeah.
Yeah, that's sensory. And for me, it's the foundation of ethics. It's the foundation of meaning. It's not the only place we get our ethics from. Of course,
Yeah.
hugging a tree does not answer all the difficult questions in life. But without that connection, I mean, imagine trying to be a good family member without listening to any of your human family members or people in your, professional circle. It's like we got to listen and we got to open our imaginations to the stories that we hear from other people and find our way through that. And the same is true with other creatures. And yeah, for me, one of those was with my sister. She and my mom lived in Scotland, near the Firth of Forth, which is a big muddy estuary that has got seagrass. And in former centuries, it had a lot of seagrass growing in it. And seagrass is, to me, one of the most mind blowing of the flowering plants. It's the simplest looking. It looks like a bunch of long strands of seaweed, but this is a flowering plant whose ancestors about 70 or more million years ago went back into the sea, and now they flower under the water in the sea. So we got flowering plants flowering in the sea. They grow in these huge big mats. They're incredibly important for biodiversity. Lots of fish and invertebrates spawn in them. They store massive amounts of carbon, more carbon stored and for longer in a seagrass meadow than any forest on land by actually 50 times for some seagrass meadows. And these meadows have really taken a hit over the last century and a half all around the world. And there's a restoration effort in the not just around Edinburgh, but in many places here in the US and other countries as well. And so my sister and I were able to go out and tromp around. I mean, I worked with some of the restoration efforts, and she and I would just go and find the seagrass. And it was like being kids again because you get to put your rubber boots on and find crabs and get muddy and get kind of a bit cold because it's too windy. And that, to me, that's the joyful memories from childhood is just being out in the world and exploring in quote unquote ordinary places like ditches and these seagrass meadows in the further forth are growing. Some of them are in scenic places, but many of them are downstream from the oil refinery, and it just to the untrained eye it looks like a big old patch of mud that's been exposed because the tide went out. But that patch of mud, in fact, is one of the biggest carbon repositories anywhere and is full of incredible biodiversity and a fun place to explore with your very tolerant sister. So my sister is not a biologist, but she indulged me. And I think I had some fun exploring these seagrasses that to the human eye just don't look that exciting until you know their story. And their story is of holding the edges of the terrestrial world together and saving us from the worst uh, consequences of our carbon profligacy, if you like.
Amazing. Well, I think we're just out of time. I could speak with you for hours, David. In fact, we do speak for hours about flavors off the podcast. I just want to say congratulations again. Incredibly beautiful book. I mean, I couldn't put it down. And I like I
So
said,
thank you.
I books that I really like, I write all inside. I have all kinds of stickies like written inside of it, and it's just such an enjoyable read that I know that so many of our listeners will also enjoy. So everybody, it comes out. Your published date is coming up soon. It's March 24th of
Mhm.
2026, and available for pre-orders right now. Get your copy, folks. This is just a fantastic read. And, it will get you to think, I think, about the world in a refreshing new way. We all need a bit more flower power and joy in our lives. And I think this book will help you find that.
Thank you, Sandra. Such a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for your work as an amazing storyteller and hub of stories around plants and people's relations to plants. I mean, I'm an absolute convert. I love the podcast and your writing as well.
Oh,
So it's such an honor for me to be here in conversation with you. So many, many thanks.
thank you. All right. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. You can find this and all of our other shows at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also head over to our YouTube channel at Teach Ethnobotany, where we have the video version of this and our other shows. I want to thank our producers, Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for helping us put this together. And you can help the show along by buying me a coffee. I always need a little extra caffeine. When you buy a coffee for us, it helps us cover some of our production costs. So you can find that on our website as well. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and we'll see you next time.